did the Prime Minister negotiate deals to put Canada at the back of the line for COVID-19 vaccines?
Canada is the best country positioned with the most doses of vaccine per capita anywhere else in the world.
The question to the Minister is simple. On what exact date will the vaccine for Canadians be here?
The member opposite is trying to confuse Canadians right now as we speak.
Canada's vaccine rollout plan continued to dominate much of the conversation here in Ottawa, with some worried the country is falling behind. But is this part of the pandemic response becoming perhaps overly political? And what are the risks for the government and the opposition? It's Thursday. I'm here with At Issue, Chantal Hébert, Andrew Coyne, and Althea Raj. It wasn't just this, I must say, this week that made me start to think whether it was getting heated politically. It was also events in Alberta with Jason Kenney, events in Ontario with an Auditor General report with Doug Ford. So it seemed like a whole bunch of things were happening. But let's start with the talk around the vaccines and how that unfolded in terms of the push of the opposition parties to try and get dates and the way the government has managed it. Chantal?
I suspect that there was always going to be a day, and Justin Trudeau knew it, when he would have to say what sounds like a no-brainer, i.e. We are buying a lot of vaccine doses, but we don't produce them. And probably the countries where these vaccines are produced will get first shot at using the vaccines. And why the day came this week, I don't believe is a mistake on the part of the Prime Minister or something he let out that he didn't mean to. Yeah. But the obvious fact that increasingly you would see rollout plans in December in some countries, the US, the UK, for vaccines. And the obvious question, why are we not rolling out vaccines in this country? Yeah. That being said, the reality that vaccines were not going to be rolled out as quickly in countries that don't produce them as versus others that do is not new. And I suspect most premiers actually expected that to be the case, as well as the Prime Minister.
I will say that Erin O'Toole, is playing fast and loose with the facts in that question there, Andrew, by suggesting that we're going to be last in line. That's not at all what we got from the government today. But give me your thoughts on how it's being handled.
Well, I don't know if we're last in line, but we're certainly behind a lot of other countries, not just the U.S., Germany, and UK, but most of Europe, parts of South America. We are far behind a lot of other countries. And I think it's a perfectly valid question to ask why. I'm not entirely sure I buy the argument that it's just because we don't produce the vaccines here. If you look at the purchasing record of the government, they didn't strike the deals to buy this stuff until August and September, which was several weeks after a lot of other countries. So I think there's more questions to be asked there, whether it's because of that, what exactly is the reason behind it. You can say that's politics and grandstanding. Of course, the opposition is always going to make more of it than needs to be made. We're going to be somewhat behind the other countries, but we're going to get the vaccines. But I don't think it's an entirely invalid question to look into.
Althea.
No, it's not an invalid question to look into. I think there is some understanding that, there are certain vaccines, like the first two that seem promising, that we obviously cannot make in this country. We just don't have the capacity to switch overnight and suddenly be able to make vaccines that are completely different from the vaccine capacity that we have in this country. What strikes me this week is that the revelation came from the Prime Minister himself. It wasn't that the opposition pressed the government and discovered something at a committee hearing. It is that the Prime Minister himself came out and laid the groundwork to say, listen, I'm tempering expectations here. While you're looking, you watch the news coming from the United States, nobody's going to be vaccinated in December. But it's clear that there was also a kind of wedge politics starting to be played. I think if you're watching Question Period, you feel that the tone and tenure has changed. The Conservatives are much more aggressive. They were going on this line of attack about rapid testing and a lack of at-home tests as being the reason why phase 2 was a lot stronger. The second wave was a lot stronger than the first wave, and blaming the Liberals for this. And the Liberals, basically, Justin Trudeau gave the Conservatives a gift by saying that the vaccines were not going to be coming as early as expected, and they've been running with that. But as they tend to do, they're making they're making the revelation larger than it actually is, where there's enough there to mine. You don't need to exaggerate and say that no one's going to be vaccinated until 2030, which is what Michelle Rempel-Garner said this week in the House of Commons. And we saw the Liberals hide behind the scientists. And this week we had, three government experts lay the foundation and say, hey, we're going to be briefing you every week about what the vaccine rollout is going to be.
Yeah, I wondered how much of what the Conservatives were doing this week, Chantal, is actually about what's happening to their friends and cousins in Alberta, in Ontario, where the management of how they've managed the pandemic is under intense scrutiny.
Yes, and premiers of different stripes from the federal government have been setting aside their differences over the course of the pandemic. But the fact that the numbers are going up in places like Alberta and Manitoba, Conservative premiers, Ontario's week was a difficult week. I figure the federal Conservatives are worried or feeling heat from that, as in Conservative premiers, Conservative Party federally. It may not totally reflect, although you did hear premiers expressing some questions and impatience this week, the mood around the First Minister's table, because once you get down to reality, there is no point in bringing morale down by starting to have a pissing contest over why aren't the vaccines in my province on December 15th. So two different agendas. Yeah. I think more of an echo from the federal Conservatives than something that is driven by premiers.
Andrew?
I think for anybody who's in government, federal or provincial of whatever party, it is going to be tough sledding over the next weeks and months. The pandemic seems every sign of getting worse. So without blaming the Liberals for that, if you're the federal opposition, you're going to be feeling a little bit more in a place to attack the government. That's just it's just natural and normal that when things are going bad for the government, you're going to be a little bit more on your front foot than you would otherwise be. So I guess I would interpret it that way.
Althea.
Well, I would say we don't know that it's actually bad for the Liberals. I mean, it's sad to say it's bad for the country and it's bad for Canadians, the numbers that we're seeing. But public opinion polls suggest that Liberals are actually having this COVID bump in terms of popularity. They're, the We Charity controversy, they've recovered from that. And I think that is partly, the Conservatives are hoping, the federal Conservatives here are hoping to mine on people's anger about a new lockdown, about more restrictive measures, about the fact that, there's so much more that we know about the virus now that we didn't know in the spring. And now we're questioning authority. And Prime Minister and the Liberals in Ottawa are very aware that they need to kind of separate the levels of responsibility. We saw the Prime Minister this morning on a Calgary radio show kind of explain that's Alberta's responsibility, and our responsibility is to make sure that we send you checks and you can try to survive as best as you can. And I think you're going to see more of that as the situation progresses.
Chantal, you can have 10 seconds. Yeah.
Oh, yes. And before we only accuse the opposition of politicizing this issue, the Prime Minister being on radio in Calgary at the time when Jason Kenney is weak and being criticized, are we not calling that politics too?
Yes, indeed. Good point.
I'm pleased to announce today that on November 30th, we will be presenting the 2020 Fall Economic Statement. Our plan will continue to support Canadians through the pandemic and ensure that the post-COVID economy is robust, inclusive, and sustainable.
That was Chrystia Freeland talking about next week's economic update, long awaited, because there's been no federal budget since March 2019. Chantal, Andrew, and Althea back for an extended round on that. Andrew, why don't I start with you? Obviously this is going to be important. It's going to be an important document for Canadians to see, for us to see. What are your expectations in terms of how it might define things or better lay out the state of things?
Low. I think we'll get.
Okay.
I think we'll get some greater measure of clarity. We'll get some kind of estimate on the deficit, which I suspect will be rather worse than our previous forecasts have led us to believe. We'll get some glimmer, but only a glimmer, of the larger agenda, in my expectation that there'll be some. They'll try to fill in some of the gap between the huge expectations, the grand vision that they were talking about in the summer, and the more prosaic need to address the pandemic itself and the economic crisis surrounding that. There'll be some measures that sort of bridge that, but I suspect they'll hold a lot of that in reserve until the spring budget. I don't think this is going to be a full budget by any means. I think there'll be some measures, but they'll be relatively modest.
I also wonder, because we haven't really, I don't even know if this is possible, but we haven't really got a sense of where they anticipate the deficit going over time. We didn't get that back in July when they gave us a snapshot. I don't know if they can do that now, or if they're interested in doing that, but I'm interested in seeing that. Chantal.
Possibly it would be in their interest to show these numbers now, because you may be interested in those numbers, but at this point, most Canadians are not, because of the second wave of the pandemic. That being said, I don't expect, like Andrew, my expectations are really low. I believe this is at best a dress rehearsal for the real thing, which will be the budget. And the fact of the second wave, I'm not going to make a prediction, but I would be amazed if any party in the House of Commons wanted to precipitate an election between now and the spring. Given the strength of the second wave, the vaccine rollout, I just don't see it. I don't see the politics of it. So, and I'm not sure that anyone really has a take that is worth taking home until next spring.
Yeah, but you could well foresee a full budget, millions of Canadians being vaccinated, and possibly an election, Althea. That starts to make a little more sense.
In the spring, of course. Yeah. So I probably have more of an expectation for this fiscal update than Chantal or Andrew, in part because this is Chrystia Freeland's first move as finance minister, that there's going to be lots of public scrutiny on her, and everything so far that she's touched has gone pretty well. She earned, huge praise for her role as deputy prime minister in terms of intergovernmental affairs and getting all the premiers on side, the renegotiation of NAFTA, even the successful conclusion of CETA. And she will want to ensure that she gets praise for this fiscal update. And in that way, I think that there may be more than we originally expected. I don't see, a plan to balance, but they have talked about these guardrails, and Ms. Freeland has talked about ensuring that they're not spending, or they're not seen to be spending in a way that is not prudent and not responsible. Number one, obviously, is going to be addressing COVID in the second wave. But also, I think we're going to expect to see a lot more meat on the bone on what was in the speech from the throne. It wasn't the build back better, build back stronger. I'm not I actually forgot what the Liberals are calling their
build back better. Yeah.
Build back better. It wasn't exactly the plan that we expected in August when they were talking to us about it, but there will be some spending announcements tied to the commitments that we heard in the speech from the throne. So there will be news, and we will have things to talk about. But and it's going to, I think, it's going to be much more than what was originally expected. It's going to be much deeper than what was presented in July, for example.
Chantal, then Andrew.
Okay, question mark. I don't see how you can reconcile fiscal guardrails, which is what a lot of people in the corporate community and elsewhere would like to see, with living up to the ambitions of the throne speech. It's going to have to be one or the other.
Yeah.
This is what they told me. A definition of parameters of anticipated investments against anticipated revenues or growth. I was like, I don't get this.
Yeah, I don't understand what that means either. Andrew.
Well, I just think vagueness has worked for them so far, and I think the trend is your friend. They will stay with that as long as they possibly can. Vagueness both in terms of the ambitious spending plans, they'll unveil some of it, and vagueness in terms of what kind of any of fiscal anchor, fiscal guardrails, fiscal whatever is the new term that they're going to impose. I think they're going to try and leave themselves as much wiggle room as they possibly can for as long as they can.
Which is a good thing, or I mean, if we don't know what the future holds, is that might seem to be smart. I don't know.
Well, the future holds a budget in the spring, and the Conservatives expect there's going to be a spring election, and the Liberals expect there's going to be a spring election.
Yeah.
So everybody is planning for a spring election. But there are things that she needs to put in that fiscal update. Like, she has to do something about climate. They've already announced billions for infrastructure, that they're obviously going to tie that to their commitments about net zero in 2050. And she has to do something about childcare and women going back to work, because they've talked a lot about it. And if they don't meet those two things, people are going to criticize them for it.
Chantal, then I probably have to go. Yeah.
That sounds to me like a prescription for a lot of vagueness.
Okay, I was going to go give Andrew the last word, but that might be too good a last word. So we'll just...
I've been out-cynicked.
Yes, you have. You have. Well done, Chantal. Okay, thank you all very much, and I'll see you Monday. Appreciate it.